Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. First, a word from the sponsor of the Compliance Podcast Network for this month, Ethico.
If you're a compliance officer, middle managers are crucial in getting your programs from you to your frontline employees. But how do we activate those managers and get them on our side? Ethico's new Middle Manager Toolkit equips you with the skills needed to empower your managers, to promote a culture where ethical behavior thrives and employees feel empowered to speak up. Learn how to turn frontline managers into ethical leaders with our new white paper, Empowering Middle Managers as Ethics Champions. And did I mention you can get the whole toolkit for free? Head to ethico.com to download the full toolkit today.
Welcome to 2025 and the first episode of 10 for 10 for the new year. Some of the stories from this past week include the letter from Frank Vogel to the Financial Times, the FT, remembering Jimmy Carter and a tribute to Jimmy Carter for his stance on corruption. Jimmy Carter was president when the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was signed into law on December 19th, 1977. And we need to remember that President Carter, unlike the incoming administration, had a very strong antipathy to bribery and corruption. So in many ways, the modern compliance profession started with the FCPA, so thanks, Jimmy Carter. Next up, from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, Richard Vandeford reporting that Bayview Asset Management has entered into a $20 million settlement over cybersecurity weaknesses. The mortgage company will make this payment to 53 state-level regulators who dinged the mortgage company for allegedly failing to cooperate in a data breach-related investigation. It really points up that you need to not only have a robust cybersecurity program, but if you do get hit, you're going to have to cooperate with the regulators or you'll be penalized. Next up, a really just sad and pathetic story from Reuters of the continued corruption in the U.S. Supreme Court. Justice Sam Alito spoke to Donald Trump by phone on Tuesday, some 30 minutes before Trump filed his petition in the Supreme Court to stay the sentencing hearing from his fraud trial in New York. Now, they claimed, they didn't talk about it, but this is Donald Trump and Sam Alito, so what do you think happened? It's clear that Trump is just going to call the Supreme Court and say, do this for me. And that's going to be the role of law in America going forward. Next up, in a slightly more satirical story, the New York Times reports that Enron is back. Yes, the pranksters behind Birds Aren't Real is back to revive the company synonymous with corporate malfeasance. So, yes, Enron is back. What does it mean for you? Well, they've apparently come up with an egg that's a nuclear reactor that you can have at home. Is it real? Well, it's Enron, so what could go wrong? Next up from Bloomberg, China, through its president Xi Jinping, has vowed to deepen its anti-corruption fight into areas such as finance and energy. They had certainly been pushing the military in this direction, but now China believes that anti-corruption or corruption in various industries is causing a huge problem in China, and so the Chinese are going to fight this. This is something that every American company needs to be very cognizant of because The next step is starting to imprison Americans or other Westerners, which has already happened in several instances. But wherever you want to be, I can assure you that in a Chinese jail, as a Westerner, is about the last place. So if you're doing business in China, you need to double check your anti-corruption program going forward. In a follow-up story to the Bloomberg stories, Reuters reports that the Chinese Communist Party cites corruption as its biggest threat to ruling. So for anyone who has ever thought that corruption does not have a political dimension, the Chinese, the communist Chinese of all people, believe it's the biggest threat to the party. And this is a clear warning from President Xi Jinping that the company is resolved to take down a long-running problem that's entrenched in Chinese society. This is not surprising, as clearly one quarter of FCPA enforcement actions literally over the past 20 years have occurred in China. And as I said a little bit earlier, wherever you want to be, a Chinese judge or Chinese jail is not one of them. So prepare for a big crackdown from China. From the National Review, the OIG has issued its compliance guidance for nursing facilities. And risk areas such as identifies recommendations and practical considerations for mitigating risks and offers important information for nursing facilities to consider when reviewing their compliance program. So a pretty good document from the OIG. In our second article from the New York Times, the former MoviePass executive Theodore Farnsworth, who ran the popular parent company, has pled guilty to securities fraud when he misled investors on the company's unlimited subscription plan. He also pled guilty to conspiracy to commit securities fraud violations as the leader of another public company, Vinco Ventures. So this guy was apparently a true piece of work, but the MoviePass offering was a total, complete, and utter failure. And now it looks like he's going to jail for that. Next up, our second article from Bloomberg, which is that the UBS Group is close to making a settlement in hundreds of millions of dollars over violations by Credit Suisse of a decade-old agreement with the DOJ relating to tax evasion. Following a guilty plea in 2014 on conspiring to help U.S. citizens evade taxes, Credit Suisse was obligated to inform authorities on its progress in closing accounts and the destinations of the funds. Credit Suisse paid some $2.6 billion, but apparently never got the message that you actually have to do compliance. And now UBS is left holding the bag on this. The amount to be paid is rumored to be in the neighborhood of some $200 million. And our final story comes to us from Law 360, which gives an update on the ongoing saga between the Department of Justice, Boeing, and the Federal District Court in Fort Worth. The DOJ and Boeing told the court that they could not reach an agreement on their deadline for an update on whether they can get a plea agreement going. And the court gave them another 6 weeks to try to work it out, extending the time date to mid-February of 2025. The issue is the monitorship, as the court rejected Boeing's plea agreement around the monitorship for its lack of transparency, lack of court oversight, and, of course, objections from the families of the victims. So the Boeing saga continues going forward. 10 for 10 is a special production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, our network sponsor is Ethico, and they've got a great new service offering for you, a middle manager's toolkit. We've linked to it in the show notes, and it's available to you at no cost. Many companies struggle with getting information to middle managers, which allows them to be the first line of response in a speak-up culture. And Ethisphere has answered this challenge by putting together a middle manager's toolkit. Check it out in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you'll check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency.